Okay, I think we are now live. So welcome everyone to TBRcon21. Hopefully this becomes an annual thing. So today's panel is the intersection of neurodivergence and speculative fiction writing. So my name's Travis Tippins. I'm one of the bloggers over at the Fantasy Inn, and I host the Fantasy Inn podcast. But you're not here for me, you're here for our wonderful guests. So I'm going to turn it over to them and allow everyone to introduce themselves and their most recent or upcoming work. I guess, Elisa, if you want to go first.
Sure, no problem. Hi, all. I'm Elisa. I am the author of 2 books that are coming out, I think, both in 2022. My debut is going to be called Brave, and it's basically a Filipino-inspired YA fantasy where 2 girls fall in love. They're from opposing cultures, and they basically have to try and stop a war so that they can be together. And I am really, really thrilled to be here. This is like my first panel appearance ever, so nice to meet all of you.
I'm Sunyi, and I live in the UK. I'm biracial and neurodivergent, and I have a book coming out a long time away now because it's been pushed back to fall 2022. It's called The Book Eaters, and it's set in an alternate 90s Britain. My editor had a really good summary of it. She called it "Be Gay, Do Crime, Eat Books," which is a lot better than my summary of 2 women traveling slowly in a train towards Scotland. So, yeah, I'll hand over to is it Essa next, I think?
Yeah. So I'm Essa Hansen. I write science fiction and fantasy, and my debut novel, No Fight Glass, came out from Orbit Books 2 months ago now. It's a sprawling space opera revenge story.
Cool. I'm Sonora. I don't have anything announced yet, but the book I got my agent with is actually contemporary. It's called The Lesbiana's Guide to Catholic School, and I'm actually also working on like a high fantasy, like Mesoamerican inspired, like kind of like it's almost like a murder mystery, but it's like high fantasy. Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. All of your work sound incredible. I have actually read Essa's book, which I can personally vouch for, but I'm looking forward to picking up everyone else's once they release. Okay, the topic of our panel is neurodivergence in SFF writing. So I figured one of the ways we could start this off is, as much as everyone's comfortable with, if you could share your personal experience with neurodivergence and your personal diagnoses. So I guess, Essa, if you want to start off.
Yeah. So I'm a late diagnosis autistic. It's only been like 2.5 years. Actually following Sunyi's diagnosis, I started realizing that our experiences were really similar, and I looked into it myself. And I also have synesthesia, which is where one sense modality cross wires with another one. So mine is auditory tactile, so I can feel and sort of see sounds in my environment. And I also have hyperphantasia, which is like a vivid mental imagination. And for me, it's kind of across all senses. So I can imagine something, and it's like watching a movie and feeling it and smelling it all at the same time.
Fantastic. I guess, Sunyi, if you want to go next.
Yeah, I'm also late diagnosed after my son was picked up. Because he's non-speaking, so I guess it was easier to diagnose him. And then off the back of that, I got my own diagnosis, and again, by then I knew Essa. We talked quite a lot, and yeah, that kicked off hers, I think, eventually as well. On top of that, I'm also alexithemic, which is a very common condition for people who are autistic to varying degrees, and it basically means I struggle to name emotions or to identify emotions. I might have symptoms of being angry, but I won't necessarily connect that and realize I'm angry or sad or happy. A lot of times I have to judge by looking at how I'm behaving. It's kind of like the mental equivalent of you don't get the right amount of sensation. Yeah, I'll hand over to who's next.
I guess Sonora, if you want to go next.
Okay. So I'm also kind of late diagnosis autistic. I was diagnosed at like 23. And I'm also schizoaffective. So like it's a schizophrenia plus mood disorder. Yeah. So like hallucinations and stuff like that.
And Elisa?
I think I'm the opposite of the whole group. So I'm the odd one out here. I was diagnosed during childhood, but I'm late sort of to the community. So I'm very late to the party because I was encouraged as a kid to mask my autism and keep it on the down low and not tell anybody about it. So that led to me like not really knowing much about it or reaching out to other people about it. I think in the past year, I've really started trying to connect with other autistic people. And that's when I've realized that, hey, the reason I do so many of the things that I do that I thought I was just being super weird is actually because I'm autistic. So, yeah.
Right. Well, thank you all for sharing that. And I think that gives us a good kind of basis to move forward with the rest of this discussion. And I want to start things out with kind of a broad question, but I think it's probably one that most people are interested in hearing first. So how does your neurodivergence affect your writing and maybe your approach to the industry? And I know several of you were diagnosed at different points in life. So if you were diagnosed after you started writing, does that change your approach at all? So I guess whoever wants to take this first.
I can go first.
Okay.
I don't think it's changed my approach. So I was diagnosed after, with the autism diagnosed after I started writing. And synesthesia, I kind of knew from when I was a teenager, figuring out online, and you sort of see things like, wait, that sounds like me, and then dive into forums, and this is my experience. So my approach hasn't changed, but it's been a continual process of understanding what's my unconscious processes are and how that comes into my writing, and realizing the strengths and weaknesses. For me, it's very much a double-edged sword. Like my imaginative descriptions and concepts are a strength, but it's very easily becomes confusing on the page. And I had to realize that the way that I naturally express my creativity and imagination in writing is not comprehensible by others. So I need a lot of rounds of editing to do like a second round of translating so that it makes sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was also diagnosed after writing, or after I'd started writing. And it just kind of explained, I remember submitting writing to a sample chapter to my local novelist group, and having people comment on things like, oh, the sensory descriptions are so kind of over the top and intense. And to me, I was writing things that were normal, and having that make sense later. And I think I definitely early on ran into a problem that anecdotally I think a lot of neurodivergent people run into, which is creating characters that are not accessible to neurotypical audiences, and learning how to find that balance between being authentic and having style and input from that perspective, but also being approachable to people. And that was a really tricky one.
I think on my end, I mean, this is something about myself that I've always known, but I've never really known what it means. And I wasn't aware that it affected my writing or how much it affected my writing until I started having an editor look over my work. And my editor would say things. I mean, my characters at this point for this upcoming book are neurotypical. So they're not autistic. I will write some books with autistic characters in the future. But there are some things that my characters experience that my editor calls out. And I was like, oh, everybody doesn't feel that? So like, you mean when everyone is really stressed out, sound doesn't fade out to this high-pitched whine? I thought that was everybody. I'm also very bad at facial descriptions. I'm bad at describing how characters look. And my editor has been kind of pushing me to do better. And I think the reason why I'm bad at that is I don't spend a lot of time looking at people's faces. And even when I do, it takes me a while to recognize a person's face when they're wearing different clothes. Maybe, after I get more comfortable with them, I'll look into their face. I actually didn't even notice what color my partner's eyes were until 1 year into our relationship. And then I was very surprised. So when I imagine my characters, I somehow just don't really imagine their faces. They're like faceless, colorful blobs that interact and do things.
Yeah, I feel like pretty much the same. Like I didn't consciously write like autistic or neurodivergent characters, but I was putting like what was relatable to me onto them. So they basically were, even if I didn't do it consciously. Like, yeah, just like, lack of eye contact, or like the sensory stuff, like it's just the way that they experience the world. And I don't know if they read, like if my characters actually read as autistic, but I feel like they kind of are. And then like definitely in my other books, like I have like very explicitly autistic characters, so there's that too. But in my first one, the one I got my agent with, it wasn't like an intentional thing. It just kind of like happened.
I found it interesting getting my books out so I get reader feedback, and realizing exactly how much like they're finding some of, especially the immersive and sensory stuff, like really unusual. And like I'm thinking that's my normal world, like this world that you find really strange and unusual is like every day for me. So, and I hadn't thought of that before when I was writing. It was just sort of writing my experience, and then it ends up sounding really imaginative and creative to other people. But to me, it's sort of much more bland.
Yeah, for the book that got me an agent, when I started writing that book, I had no idea about being autistic. And over the course of that year, got that diagnosis. So while I was writing, I was figuring it out. And by the time I finished that book, I realized I'd written an autistic character without intending to. I mean, that book didn't get picked up. I hope it will someday. But it comes in. I think you can't kind of get away from that perspective. And even in stories where I don't set out to have protagonists who are autistic, I tend to pick perspectives of people who are aliens or monsters or other, because that feels more natural in a way. But being slightly outside of society.
Right. I think that's one thing that a lot of readers might think of when they hear of autistic characters is, there's the stereotype of autism as being non-creative and not really emotional. So how do you write emotion and emotional reactions into your characters, or just how do you approach this in general?
I feel like my characters are very emotional. Like I'm a very emotional person. Like I just express my emotions maybe a little bit differently than other people do. And I think that's the case with a lot of autistic people. Like I don't think we're necessarily like don't have emotions. So yeah, my characters are very emotional. They just like will express their emotions maybe a little bit differently. And like they all kind of have their little like, I guess, quirks of like how they express themselves that I've given them. And I guess that does relate back to like my autism and how I know to express my emotions. Yeah.
I'm sort of the same. Like I'm an emotional person, and I don't struggle with even describing emotions, but it's sometimes a struggle to figure out how a reader will respond to a particular emotion, or and this is sort of a broad, if not universal writerly struggle of trying to figure out how much or what you put on the page is too on the nose, and how much you've buried in subtext so that the reader can't pick it up. That's sort of still an ongoing struggle in terms of writing emotion for me.
I'm a very emotional person as well. So I I kind of take issue with that stereotype a lot of times because I think, on the other end of the spectrum, I'm a little too emotional about things. And sometimes the things that I'm emotional about are not things that neurotypical people around me understand why I'm getting upset about these things. So my characters also have pretty strong emotions. And I mean, I write high fantasy, and I'm always attached to that idea of those big dramatic moments where like people are having messy feelings all over the place and they're screaming and fighting and etc. So yeah, you're going to see some of that in basically all of my books. Whether the expression of those emotions are like, whether the reader can connect with those feelings, I haven't yet, my books haven't been released yet. So I think what I'm hoping is that you guys, when you read my books, can tell me if you understood my characters or not. And then I can see if I wrote them okay.
I think for me, one of the things I like about writing is that I have more leeway. So there's this really good craft book by Donald Mass called The Emotional Craft of Fiction, where he talks about how even the best writers, I mean, it doesn't specify neurotypical people, but even the best writers can't force a reader to experience a certain emotion, and you're aiming to provoke rather than to recreate, if that makes sense. So I feel like I have leeway because I can write a scene about a funeral, and a reader might find it funny, even if I thought it was sad, or they might find it, heartwarming or something. And it doesn't matter, because as long as they feel something, it still creates an emotional connection. And in conversation, it's harder. You have to get that right. You have to make people understand what you're feeling. You have to generate the right feeling. But in a book, there's so much more leeway for interpretation, and that's sort of understood by the reader a lot of times, I think. So I don't know if I get it right, but I also don't worry about it as much, as long as I make them feel something. As long as that feeling isn't they want to shut the book and throw it away, then I think it's okay. So.
Right. And then I think kind of the flip side of this is as well, like historically, neurodivergent characters are often portrayed as like robots or artificial intelligences, or, like Vulcans or aliens, people who cannot like get human emotions. So I want to just open that up to all of you. And how do you feel about that?
Sorry to talk again so soon, but I actually love Vulcans as a representation of autistics in space. I think they're really well done. I almost wonder if one of the writers was familiar with the topic, but Vulcans are actually very emotional in Star Trek lore, and they're very sensory. They have strong sensory awareness, and they're so emotional and they're so sensitive that they have to lock everything down, and that's why they have this kind of masking. So, I mean, effectively Vulcans mask in Star Trek, and I think that's why maybe they connect so well with a lot of the kind of autistic community in Star Trek, that they are very emotional, and they're very passionate, and they're very logical, and they care about things but just not in quite the same way that humans do, and they don't express it in the same way, and they have different methods of dealing with being overwhelmed. So, but yeah, in general, we're maybe not always best represented.
And there's sort of the catch-22 of like we're relating to the positives, while stereotypes are often focused on the negatives. So like in film school, my nicknames were Borg, Terminator, Megatron, like all of these sort of cyborg characters, which was coming from positive traits. Like I was always on time, my work was fast, it was high quality, I was analytical and like solution driven. And it may have also behind my back been about like the social aspect struggles with communication and interpretation of intent and stuff. But it was coming from like they were seeing the positive traits and connecting it to these like robotic cyborg characters, which I didn't mind because it was, the positive I do relate to. But yeah, the emotion, they're almost always, the representation misses the emotion part.
Sorry, Essa, please.
No, go ahead.
I think that I'm personally kind of neutral on those representations. I think that they're good and they're valid for some people, but I personally don't really connect to. I mean, I connect to the. I usually tend to connect the characters that are inexplicably, like, they care very deeply about things, and they don't. Maybe they don't know how to relate to their friends, or they don't know how to talk to other people, and they have like really strange bursts of emotion that happen randomly. But at the same time, my mom is autistic and she loves the Vulcans and she loves those characters. So I'm super happy that they exist. I just wish that we had a more varied spectrum of autistic characters to choose from. And I feel like a lot of those characters hit the emotional side of autism, the inability to connect socially sometimes, and the difficulty with feelings and regular like tone of voice and things like that, but kind of miss the sensory issues, which I honestly struggle with a lot and don't really see. So,
yeah. I feel sorry.
No, go ahead. I'll add on to Lisa's in a bit.
Oh no, you can if it's adding on to Elisa.
I was just going to say with the sensory stuff and like my synesthesia, because that's not really represented very much in media either. Like the sort of sensory world that I live in, I don't see representation, and it's not really something, since it's invisible, you can't really represent it in a character. But in sci-fi and fantasy, we have the ability to have an alien species or a fantasy species that has a sensory world that's really similar, and you can put that on the page and try and get readers to connect with the experience through a non-human character or through a human character that experiences that way because of magic or because of different mode of consciousness in the genre.
Yeah, I feel like my my feelings on it kind of vary. Like on one hand, it does kind of suck that there's not more like representation like of like humans being autistic and like having those symptoms. But at the same time, I do know a lot of like autistic people who will write like autistic characters as aliens or like whatever else, because of like this feeling of not really belonging like with the humans, I guess. So like I do feel like it kind of like works in a lot of cases. But at the same time, for like neurotypical people to write it that way, it hits a little differently. You know what I mean? And I've also noticed like this is not just a thing with like autism or neurodivergence, but like there's also like with trans representation, especially non-binary representation, they're often portrayed as like aliens who use neutral pronouns. Like that's a thing.
Yeah.
Or what?
Deities. I've seen the gender neutral god characters so many times.
Yeah, but like and it again, it's not necessarily like a bad thing. It's just like if you're not of that group and you write it this way, like why do you feel like these non-human characters are the ones who can have these traits instead of the human characters, if that makes sense. But like I feel like if it's own voices, that's a completely different story.
Yeah, and especially because so many autistic people, there's massive overlap between the autistic community and LGBTQ communities. So it's just that side gets missed out a lot, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so we've kind of hit on like aspects of this next question, but I do want to ask, are there any common misconceptions or mistakes that you see other writers, whether they're neurodivergent or not, that they make when they're trying to write neurodivergent characters?
Okay, before we move on to this one, somebody with a username that looks suspiciously like my mom is on the chat, the comments going, "Mom is a Vulcan." So I want to just apologize to my mother. Yes, Mom, you are a Vulcan. Okay.
Oh, I guess, yeah, before we move on, there's also another question. So outside of Vulcans, are there any other characters in books, TV, or film that you would say are good representations?
I like Entrapta from She-Ra.
Yeah.
I think she's great.
I don't know any characters that are confirmed to be autistic, but I know I have a few that in my head totally are. Yep, my mom pointed out the film, yeah. But I think personally, like, I don't know how many of you guys watch Hero Academia, My Hero Academia. Todoroki in my head is autistic, and none of you guys can take that away from me.
Yes.
I haven't seen the show, but I know from my autism groups on Facebook that the protagonist in Queen's Gambit is considered to be kind of an autistic representation, that she has a lot of those traits, and that when you read about the author's history and stuff, it feels like he could well be neurodivergent. Just the way that he was institutionalized and stuff as a child. So I don't know where he fits into that, but she's regarded as pretty decent autistic rep unofficially. What they call autistic coded, I think. Characters who are written with those traits but never specified.
I watched the TV show Hannibal before my diagnosis. And I really resonated with Will Graham, and especially the hyper empathy represented in that show. And then later watched it again with my diagnosis, and like, this makes so much sense why I was, connecting with traits this character was displaying that, and in the show he's on the spectrum, they state at one point. But I thought it was a really good job, and yeah, that's my example.
I actually have another one. So this one is unofficial also, and people are probably going to get mad at me about it. People have gotten mad at me about it, but I will never shut up about it. I strongly feel like Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender is autistic.
Yes.
Like, he has so many, and I feel like that's like a portrayal. Like, I know the creators probably didn't do it on purpose, but he's autistic. Okay, like he'll be like meditating and Iroh like interrupts him and he has a meltdown, or like he copies like Azula's language and he takes everything at face value, like he believes everyone's lies. He doesn't understand Iroh's metaphors. Like, he's autistic. Okay, like 100%.
He has that one scene in Sonora before meeting the Aang group where he rehearses his
yes, that
speech.
too. He rehearses his, oh my gosh, yes. And not knowing how to like respond to like emotional moments, like that's rough, buddy. Like, come on. Yes, 100%.
Yeah, I think David Mitchell, as for just like a kind of big trade published author who's probably neurotypical, he writes some pretty decent autistic characters, I think. Maybe that comes from his experience of his son. He sort of steers away from the martyr. He doesn't have any martyr parent stories that I'm aware of in his writing, but he has some pretty good autistic characters as well. I've not seen Avatar. Sorry, go on.
Anne of Green Gables. When I was a kid, that was a book that I really related with because I felt a lot like Anne. So,
yeah, these are all very interesting examples, and a lot of them I didn't pick up on when I was first either reading or watching that media. But yeah, thank you all for pointing those out. Let's see. But yeah, so I guess back to the previous question before that fantastic conversation. Just what are some, I guess, common mistakes or things that you wish writers would do better when they're writing neurodivergent characters?
I would say making them actually three-dimensional. Like, I feel like a lot of portrayals of neurodivergent characters is like they are neurodivergent and that's them and that's everything. And like neurodivergent people, like, yes, like neurodivergence kind of like is intertwined with every aspect of our lives, but that doesn't mean that like there aren't other aspects of our lives, if that makes sense. And like also intersectionality, like I feel like that's a big thing, because it's like Sunyi said, like there's this big intersection between like, you know, neurodivergence and like queerness, or like, you know, like people of color. Like I am like a neurodivergent, queer, like disabled person of color. Like there's a lot of like nuance that goes into like writing characters that are like intersectional. And I feel like a lot of people don't like miss that nuance especially when it comes to like neurodivergence.
I would also say like not just using the neurodivergence as an easy source of conflict in the story, not just focusing on the negatives of it or having it, you know, something they need to struggle with or to be otherwise a problem to solve, but to have a fully rounded character in other ways. Sorry, I'm getting an echo in my headset.
No, that's right. I think so. My least favorite kind of stereotype of writing is one that isn't considered to be a stereotype. I think that it is, and there's been some essays on it. But basically, the manic pixie dream girl character, who is often a type of autistic coded woman, and it's just like that whole stereotype is crap anyway. But just that you can read up on it. There's loads of discussion about basically how it's harmful, and it's really quite tragic as a characterization of autistic women, the quirky, isolated, slightly gullible, hypersexual, probably bisexual, and it's I think it's really pervasive. I would also just like to see kind of more variety, more instead of just carbon copies of Sheldon Cooper, who I think is kind of a douche as a character. Just, you know, a bit more interesting, a bit more variety to it. Oh, sorry, very quickly, I was going to add on to the last question. For good autistic rep, Ada Hoffman's website has an autistic book party, which has her reviewed lists of books either by or about autistic characters, autistic people. So that's quite a good source. Right, sorry, anyway. That's my delayed reaction.
Yeah, I don't really have too much to add on this, except like I'm going to echo that call for more variety, because I feel like we always get one type of autistic character, and it's usually like a Sheldon Cooper type, a man who has very specific preferences and who is mean to everybody and who doesn't understand emotion. And it would be wonderful to see more types of characters and to see some intersectionality addressed, like Sonora said. So that's basically my thoughts on this.
Yeah, there's a good comment that I want to read just so people with only access to audio can hear this as well. So if from the Harlequin 1968, if you're not neurodivergent, do the research. In many aspects, neurodivergent people are pretty mainstream. We just process differently. It's disappointing to be portrayed as either the comic relief, assassin, or geek.
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah. So I guess we touched on this briefly with Sonora's comment in the last question, but I want to talk a little bit about, I guess, the intersectionality of neurodiversity. So, I mean, that could be queerness, that could be race, that could be gender, that could be, you know, anything. So I guess in general, I just want to open this up to however you all want to address this.
If you want me to not be friends with you, the easiest way to do that is to open a conversation with, but you don't look autistic. If anyone else has ever heard that before. Exactly. Because it's code for you don't look like Sheldon Cooper, which is like, yes, that's true, but that's because there's so much more to it's not a white guy disorder, put it that way.
I hate it also because I think that sometimes people think they're paying you a compliment. Like one of the things that I heard is, but you're not that bad. And it was like, what does that even mean? And also, you don't know what's going on behind this.
Yeah.
Yeah, it erases, you know, the actual struggles going on, or, you know, what it takes to function, and to mask and to look, you know, like you're fine.
Right.
Yeah, I will say, like, on intersectionality, like, in my experience, like, being like a, like, you know, Mexican American autistic person, the reason why I got my diagnosis so late is because, like, my family, like, very, like, traditional Mexican family, like, didn't believe in, like with my dad, it was like, you only go to the doctor if, like, you're bleeding, if I can see a bone, like like it's like extreme situations that you go to the doctor, not because, like, you know, you think a little differently or whatever. Like, and so when I finally did get my diagnosis as an adult, I did it on my own. And when I told my parents, I was like, hey, like, I just got diagnosed as autistic. My mom was like, "Oh yeah, I could have told you that." I was like, "Are you serious? And you never, like, thought to, like?" Yeah, so that a little frustrating, but, like, I guess they didn't want me to deal with, like, stigma or anything too. But
yeah, when I got married and I told my parents, that's the point my mother chose to tell me that they'd actually had me assessed as a child, and they stopped the assessment because she felt that she could just kind of train away all the problematic behaviors at home, which is kind of a very sort of Chinese parent mindset. Like, I mean, she meant well, but I don't think that was a good result. So I was a bit annoyed about that. But she came to the interview, you know, she helps, because you have to have a parental interview. If you get a diagnosis in the UK, they interview your parents and stuff. So she did help on that side of it.
Yeah, I probably would not have gotten diagnosed as a kid all the way in the Philippines if it wasn't because of external circumstances at a time in my life where I was so stressed out, I was melting down basically on the daily. And then when I was diagnosed, my mom asked the psychologist, what does that mean? And the psychologist told her, and she was like, oh, that's me too. And probably, like, a significant chunk of my relatives. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of people, especially people who aren't the standard white man in the West, who don't get diagnosed because of this.
Right. I guess the next thing I want to talk about is we've kind of talked about the writing aspect of everything, but writing is more than just the content of what you put in your manuscripts, right? So I'm curious, did any of you ever encounter editors or agents saying they can't relate to your characters because they're neurodivergent or anything like that?
I think this goes along with the intersectionality of it. Like, I did get a lot of comments of can't relate to the voice, but, like, it could have been because, like, maybe some characters may have been, like, autistic coded, or it could have been because the way that she talks is very, like, it's like a very Mexican book. So it could have been because of that. Like, there's a lot of different, like, reasons. So I wouldn't have any way of knowing if it was because of that or not.
I've definitely gotten the, I can't connect to this character response before. But I think for me, it's more people struggling to connect to some of the writing style. And again, like the double-edged sword of I can write really immersive, sensory, lush prose, but, like, the word choices that I go to and the metaphors and analogies, it's like how I experience things, and it's how I want to describe it isn't really relatable. And in the best cases, like, if I do it right and I'm careful with my clarity, then it evokes a unique experience for the reader. But if I don't, then it's, just incomprehensible sort of experience that I'm trying to convey. So it takes a lot of work to carve that out.
I think for Anchor, which is the book that found me an agent, even before diagnosis, I had an awareness that because the first book I'd written, there was lots of, we can't connect to this kind of character. So I still had that kind of character in the book, but they weren't the narrator and they weren't the protagonist. And that, I mean, I guess in an ideal world, people would try anyway, but it just gave extra time where I had a very kind of conventional neurotypical narrator who's very extroverted and stuff, kind of bringing the text in and introducing the story. And then hopefully by the time people were reading, the more neurodivergent character, they're sort of invested in seeing what happens next. I don't think I've had any issues with editors myself. I know Ada Hoffman has talked a bit about one of their friends who went on submission, and I had an editor return their manuscript with the note saying, this character isn't authentically autistic. And then they used Atypical, the kind of Netflix show, as their evidence for this. And they're saying this to an actual autistic author, which is really bad form. To firstly say that, your representation of yourself is not authentic. And secondly, here's the TV show I saw to prove it. So it does happen, I think. And just, the fact that there are very few autistic authors in sci-fi and fantasy who are published by the big four. But we're overrepresented in fans, we're the super fans. We fill conventions, we wear the costumes, we're really engaged in keeping sci-fi and fantasy afloat, but very few of us are recognized or published as creators.
I haven't, in my life, I haven't gotten a whole lot of feedback, just a whole lot of rejections. It's been a very hard road to get to the book level thing. And like Sonora, I'm not really sure why. Like, I don't know if it's because people couldn't connect to my characters because they were coded autistic without me knowing it. If my writing was just bad and I needed time to get my writing to the point where people liked it. People who weren't my classmates, who were my primary audience, like all the way until I left school. Or if, I don't know, there's a great thread on Twitter right now about people, the active character who makes all the decisions and runs into situations and takes on the world is sort of a Western construct. My characters, especially in the early days, had a lot of things happen to them. And I was living at the time in the Philippines where a lot of things were happening to me. And I was just having to deal with all these things happening to me. So I do wonder if some of those early rejections were just because my characters weren't active enough, weren't running out and saying, I will change the world, and we're just trying to survive in it. So it's really hard to say.
Yeah, I do remember reading that Twitter thread, and I think my favorite takeaway from it is that survival in the face of things happening to you is an active choice, right? Like, that's not a passive choice, and so that's very valid. Yeah, so I guess how do you try to bridge towards, say, neurotypical readers who might be struggling to relate to your experience? And is there anything about science fiction, fantasy, genre fiction in general that makes that easier or harder?
People are more willing to try something outside their comfort zone if they're reading sci-fi and fantasy, would be my experience. So we're more willing to say, okay, I don't understand what someone from planet Zoidberg or whatever is thinking, but I'll give the author a chance to explain it. And I think you have a bit of leeway in that sense to also create characters who think differently and respond differently to sensory stimuli.
Yeah, and I think we can create worlds in which hypersensory or extrasensory perception is featured as normal, as a lens into new experience for the reader. And I think it's interesting that in sci-fi and fantasy we can get away with not using labels. So in Rivers Solomon's An Unkindness of Ghosts and Ada Hoffman's The Outside, like the word autism is never used, and those have autistic main characters. But they feel really real, and they're moving through this world with their unique experience. But it's not like the label's never put on it. It's never, called out. And just, I think it avoids a lot of stereotypes by not bringing that up and just presenting a human character who's three-dimensional going through the story.
Yep, 100%. I think sci-fi and fantasy readers are already primed to accept strange and unusual things that are outside of their experience. I don't know how much harder this would be if I were writing like contemporary. So maybe Sonora, since you do write contemporary, you could speak to that a little bit. sorry to put you on the spot, but
that's okay.
I think that before I was fully comfortable with thinking of myself as autistic, I did like a lot of characters because they were quirky, and I think that that's way more acceptable in sci-fi fantasy than in other genres. Just interesting characters who think in different ways.
Yeah, that's true. I do feel like in contemporary, a lot of readers are just trying to relate to the main character, whereas in like speculative fiction, they're not necessarily trying to relate because this character could be, any, like they might not be human, like you might not have that need to relate to them as much, so it's easier to kind of like put yourself out of the equation and just read the book as this is like a different kind of person. So I do feel like in that sense it's a little bit like more acceptable, I guess. I think when you're writing like neurodivergence in contemporary, at least for me, I do feel pressure to make it like an issue book instead of just making the character just happen to be neurodivergent. Whereas like I feel like in fantasy, it's really like easy to not make it an issue book. It could just be this is the character and this is the world they're in, and like a completely like a plot that has nothing to do with that necessarily. Yeah, I do feel like there's kind of pressure in contemporary to educate. So if you have that character, it feels like I feel a pressure to like educate people about what that means instead of just having them be neurodivergent. Yeah.
Yeah, I do kind of want to follow up on that. I'm curious, do any of you, especially I guess if you started writing before you had your diagnoses, do you feel like an internal pressure now that, like now that I am this thing, I have to be like a fantastic example of this thing for the world? Is that something you feel or no?
Honestly, not for me. And I guess I kind of like feel more of a freedom to be able to write these things like, oh, this is like who I am. And like, yes, there is pressure in some sense of like not wanting to misrepresent it. But I kind of feel like if I write to my own experience and people feel misrepresented by that, that's not my fault. You know what I mean? Like that we're not a monolith and people can't expect us to be. So like if another reader, like I don't expect everyone to feel represented by my work. Like just I feel like the feeling that I want to get away from it is like it's nice to be able to like show a character that has like a lot of my intersections, or at least some of them. Like it's kind of hard for me to write a character with all of my intersections. Like I'm still working on that, but I do feel like people can appreciate, at least I hope they would appreciate that instead of looking for expecting a specific kind of experience to be represented, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
For my synesthesia and some of the sensory stuff in my sci-fi world, it's actually been really fun to kind of be able to put that on the page however I want. Like there's sort of no limit to being able to describe things that are sort of wild or bizarre or weird. It's been nice to have characters who are able to engage with the world and even these other dimensions and things like space and time at a really rich and nuanced level.
I think it's also just to build off both of those, and especially at Sonora's point, we really aren't representative of like the community as a whole. There's there's additional barriers for a lot of autistic people. So there's a big divide within the community between people who are non-speaking or unreliable speaking and people who are speaking, for example. And I can't represent someone who's non-speaking. That it is a very different experience from mine, just looking at my son and how he grows and how he relates to the world around him. His childhood is not mine, and it's not comparable. So it's just, I think that's why it's about kind of, you find as many diverse voices as you can so that those different experiences are modeled. And we're only just now getting to the point where non-speaking autistic people are actually heard and given some attention. That's a relatively new thing.
Yep. I think building off of Sunyi's point, we really are not a monolith. My core family has 3 autistic women in it, and we disagree on so many things that it's incredible. Like, we can't, some people need complete silence, some people need a little bit of noise, some people have trouble sleeping, some people have trouble waking up, some people have trouble with bright lights at the concert, some people want the bright lights at the concert and don't, I think it's unfair to expect any one person to perfectly capture everybody's experience, because it's just impossible. I mean, there's not one way to be autistic. There's not one way to be anything, really. And I think it's important that we have different kinds of representation.
Right. Well, so I guess in other parts of like the general writing industry, how does your neurodivergence affect you? I know sometimes people face extra hurdles in things like conventions or events, or just in how either they are promoted by others or they can self-promote themselves.
So I've never been to conventions or events, and that's not really down to being autistic. It's just more down to the fact that I'm a single parent. I've not really had any income for years and years until I sold a book. And even then it's a bit limited now. So for me, that was more like, I guess, a financial barrier. But I do think, I mean, I've talked about this a bit, I think in the Twitter chat, that in some studies they did in the UK, they found that autistic life expectancy is between 36 and 54 years. And it's lower if you have comorbid health conditions, which a lot of us have. And it's kind of, maybe it's a coincidence or not, but the average age for a debut fiction author in trade publishing is 36. And it just, to me, it's really striking that those two numbers line up, that, you know, at one end of it, autistic people are dying basically before they become, because writing is often a second or third career. It's something a lot of people come to later in life. And I think there might actually just be a barrier where a lot of us die young, not either from abuse or suicide or comorbid health conditions that aren't supported and recognized. And that's just kind of underlying, maybe that's just part of it being a disability. It's an underlying factor, I think, in why, in a barrier to publication.
So sorry.
Sorry, was that? No, that's right. Yeah, so that always stands out to me.
Yeah, I haven't been to a con yet because of the pandemic, but I have done a lot of virtual events for my book launch, which were a lot harder than I was expecting. And I was doing so many that it was sort of a crash course in how to manage it. Like, do I need to build in time to rest after doing a panel or doing an interview or a podcast or something like that? Like, how much rest time do I have to build in? How much prep time do I have to build in? Like, for how long before this event am I going to be stressing about it and, like, you know, trying to get my thoughts together? And even just like if I have processing time, like I'm writing an email or writing a book, like I can get my thoughts out and constructed well. But when processing time is limited in an in-person interaction or something like an interview or an event like this, like I can't arrange my speech sometimes in the way that it is in my head. Like there's a disconnect. And then it's frustrating that it's not coming out the way that it's like lined up in my brain. So figuring out how to work with that processing time And like, if I get questions in advance, am I going to try and memorize my answer? If I try to deploy a memorized answer and I have a hiccup, am I just going to completely blank on the rest of it? Or am I going to be able to pick myself back up? Or do I write notes to refer to, and will that help me get the rest of my ideas together? Or is it better to just not know what the questions are going to be and try and do it blind? So I don't have any solid answers for myself yet, but that was the process of like, how do I make this easier, because it is very hard.
I'm okay. I love going to cons as an audience member. I have not yet had a chance to go as a panelist or a writer. With public speaking in general, I am very afraid of it. So I don't know if you guys know, but I'm very terrified right now. But when I was getting my PhD, I made it a point to learn how to speak publicly, because I thought, I might still make a career out of science. I don't know, but I wanted to be the science person who can explain to people what I'm doing. So I think I'm very terrified of that part of this whole process, but I'm working to prepare myself for it. What I really struggle with is self-promotion, because look, despite all appearances, I'm a Filipino autistic person, and I am very bad at talking about myself and saying, everybody please come buy my books, they will be great. Because I think I still am conditioned to be humble and not talk about myself, and not brag or boast about my books. And I'm in this stage now where I have to do that. I have to go out on Twitter and say, please add my book to Goodreads, without sounding like I'm begging. And also, how do I write that post without, and I think the autism doesn't help, because then I'm like, how do I write this post and sound good? I think that's the part I'm currently struggling the most with.
Mm-hmm. I have a similar struggle, like with Twitter in general, though. Like this is why I don't tweet that much. Every time I tweet, like I have to stare at the words for so long, reread it, rewrite it like so many times to make sure it sounds like natural, or like like this is how people talk, right? Like I don't know, I just can never like I will have friends who like they'll have a thought and they'll just tweet it out, and I'm like, how? Like, how does this work? I just can't do it.
I'm forgiving.
Terrified of Twitter, so I get you.
Yeah.
I hate more than anything being misunderstood. Mm-hmm. And I see all of these, like, people post something on Twitter and then everybody piles on them for something or another, sometimes justified, sometimes I'm not sure what the thing was. And I'm so scared. So I look at each of my words very, very carefully for the same reasons.
Yeah.
I always feel like Twitter is how my career will eventually end. Eventually I'm just going to say the wrong things. I always say the wrong thing eventually. And the world will just like come for me, and I'll have to close my Twitter account and live in my bedroom for the rest of my life and feel embarrassed. It just feels like a matter of time. Yeah, social media is really harsh and unforgiving place.
And I think that's hard, especially for autistic people, because I think a lot of us at one point in our lives have had the experience of saying the wrong thing, having something be taken the complete opposite way from how you thought it was going to be taken, because your tone was different, or you didn't say the right words, the magic sentence that unlocks the conversation that everyone seems to know, but you don't. And I think, yeah, the risk. I'm convinced that Twitter's going to come for me someday. I don't know what it's about, but they will.
I'm sorry, I just seen that someone asked in the comments if the time to think about how social interactions play out is what draws autistic people to fiction. I don't know if it does or not, but I definitely appreciate that in fiction you can take your time. You know, heck, I can spend a month thinking of like a witty reply for a character, which I would never think of in real life. And that dialogue in fiction is pointful. It's structured. Everyone is saying pointful stuff, and it's all building towards a point. Whereas in real life, everyone's just kind of waffling, and it's a bit random. And sometimes it doesn't feel any point other than to kill silence, which is like, what? So there's, yeah.
I'm pretty sure I modeled most of my like outward persona off of fiction as a kid. Like reading books and a character would say something in response to that. And so I'd stand in the bathroom when no one's looking and try that line out several times until it feels right, and then inject it into a conversation.
Yes. I do that too.
Oh, that's such a good line. I'm going to practice this so that I can use it naturally.
Yeah. I do that too. Where I'll just like hear someone say something and I'm like, that sounds like a cool thing to say. I'm going to practice that in my head. And then I psych myself up to be able to say the thing. And then it always sounds weird when I say it.
Yeah, I've had to memorize my book pitch. And I think now I have it down. But for as much as I practice scripts in real life for social interactions, like there's a 20% chance that I will completely mess it up in an interview or something, even though I've gone over it over and over, just because of nervousness, like phrase wires or something.
And also people go off the script that you planned, and it's like, why did you do that?
I've come to really love like the podcasters and moderators that have like the clear plan, and like those are the questions that they ask. It's fine to deviate, but that like I have some structure that I can rely on to help get through it. So thank you, Travis.
Yeah, that was really great. I really did appreciate that you sent those out. I mean, I know we have deviated, but even just the opening parts where I'm still nervous, knowing what's coming next is really wonderful.
And I think in terms of like industry accessibility, that's one thing that like accessibility for autistic and other neurodivergent folks, like people don't think about accommodating or asking, what our specific needs are versus maybe some other disabilities. But it would be nice to see more of that accommodation in the industry.
Yep. So there's a question from Maya in the chat. I'm wondering if anyone touched on the idea that neurodiverse writers might have trouble writing characters because in real life we have a disconnect socially.
Fictional characters behave in a much more predictable way than real human beings do. But yeah, I do think that sometimes I just have to think what a realistic response to the situation, realistic for a neurotypical person response to the situation would be.
There's a writing advice for dialogue to like go to a cafe and to like eavesdrop on conversations and write down how people actually talk. But I don't think it's useful at all for like dialogue in fiction, because that's not how we write it. Like that's not a good way to read, where people are interrupting each other and the topics are kind of getting cut off. And that's what we're encountering socially all the time. Whereas in fiction, it's like very clean and the ideas like flow a lot nicer, easier to read and to write than the messiness of real interactions.
Yeah, a lot of my degree is in social linguistics, and a lot of that was listening to recorded phone calls. And there is a branch of social linguistics. You can go into semantics, where you actually put dialogue that people are saying into kind of like maths equations almost, or diagrams. And there's a structure to it. And basically the structure is just, you would never use it in writing because it's a lot of filler, this, that, people interrupting each other. It's all over the place. I don't know about other people. This is a bit weird, but I learned to do my dialogue from kind of reading Plato, because it's this kind of question and answer format that builds the point, and that worked for me. And it's so unnatural, but I think, I don't know, characters are okay because I think like Elisa was saying, characters in fiction are not like in real life. And, real life doesn't have a narrative. Your life is not a book. You're not working towards a happy ending. There's no arc. We're not consistent. We don't understand ourselves that well. And our conversations are not structured and pointful the way that they are in fiction, where everything is a controlled environment and I can control it like some kind of evil mini god.
And we have the processing time to control it. whether that's an emotional reaction.
Edit it. You get one shot in conversation, but you get as many years or months as it takes for a book to get it right.
At least your first book, and then you have that awful thing called a deadline. But
yeah, that's true.
So one thing that I don't think we've actually directly addressed so far is just how does neurodivergence give a valuable perspective and experiences that others might not have?
I'm going to poke Essa to say this first because she's got a
well, like I've been really happy to hear like the biggest thing that my readers are responding to is my imagination, my immersive and sensory prose and unique concepts. So I feel like I'm learning to leverage the strengths of it a lot better, and sort of using the way that I experience the world, which for me is often a struggle and a negative because I can't control the world, but I'm experiencing it, especially sound, like to such a detail that it's debilitating. But I can use that as a sort of superpower in fiction to craft these worlds that feel incredibly rich and immersive, and also to represent experiences that just are sort of otherworldly, but make them feel real.
I think as a teen, I didn't communicate very clearly in a way that most people would consider clear. I relied on a lot of metaphors and kind of phrases from movies and films. So if anyone's ever seen the famous Star Trek episode, Darmok and Jalad, where they have these aliens who are speaking in references to their history, and that was a bit what my communication was like. But as I've gotten older and kind of gotten over that, I find it really useful to writing to be able to think in metaphors, that I think of concepts and translate them very easily to fictional things I can put into a book and make accessible to people, that they can kind of understand my point, understand a really complex point that I would otherwise struggle to explain, by having it be in a story and by having it be creative writing.
And I don't know about the rest of you, but like I spend so much time people watching and like and memorizing like mannerisms and phrases and things that I can use in social situations later, and sort of like collecting these little tidbits of how to interact. But I think that people watching and that attention to the details of people and trying to kind of get into their skin, then translated into writing, comes out as more internal depth to the character, and maybe more sensitivity to sort of those little details.
Right. I think we all have these unique perspectives because of the way we experience the world. To build off of what Essa said, I'm a chronic eavesdropper. If there's a conversation happening anywhere within earshot of me in a language that I can understand, I am listening. Like you could be talking about walking your dog, the most banal thing, and I'm listening. And I've been doing that for basically my whole life. I have memories of my parents, or my mom and my grandfather, sitting me down and telling me, if you're going to listen into a conversation, please don't respond. Because I would chime in from like with the bed where I'm sleeping when my mom and grandpa are like off talking in the corner. And I think that obviously, I mean, I don't know how my books are going to look to an outsider. And right now I'm so close to the page that I can't really see the whole book for the individual words and phrases. But I think that perspective might be in the book somewhere, like a different way of describing sensory experiences, a different way of going through dialogue. And I think like my personal special interest is reading from a lot of different perspectives. So I think that honestly, the more perspectives that we have in literature, the more enriched literature will be, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Do anyone else have to do like a slightly tangential, but as part of my autism assessment, I had to do a creative story test. I don't know if anyone else did that because I know it varies across country. Okay, I'd heard about this in advance, and it absolutely terrified me because I thought, oh, if I have to do this creative story test and I'm really good at it, either they'll think I'm not autistic or I'll be terrible at it and I'm actually just a really rubbish writer. I didn't know. It was hard. It was hard. And what I realized from that is that what they were testing is, it's not that I'm bad at creating stories, it's just the way they wanted me to create a story as part of the autism diagnostic test didn't make sense to me. It was like, oh, pick 5 inanimate objects from this bag, and then you have to make a story about them. And it had all these rules, and it was just the weirdest thing. And it was really difficult. So I do think there's something going on where autistic people are maybe creating stories in different ways, which has contributed to this stereotype of us not being creative. And it's just that creativity for us was being measured differently in a lot of cases.
Interesting.
Okay, I know we're coming up on time. Let's briefly address one last listener question from Nicholas. Do you think short fiction would be an easier place to explore neurodivergence?
Oh, that's a good question.
I feel like it depends on the story. Like, because I feel like maybe there are some stories where it might be easier in short fiction, but like, and I'm more of a novel writer than a short story writer. But I do write short stories. I just feel like there's so much that can be explored in a novel that, like, I feel like novels for me are how I choose to do it. Just because there's like so much nuance that like you can put out there when like a short story only has so many words that you can use. But maybe that works better for some people. I don't know.
I think you would have to focus.
I think it probably depends on the writer, doesn't it? Because
yeah,
I love writing short fiction, but I don't write very much of it. I don't think I've ever had a neurodivergent character in a short story, just because, especially because I love flash fiction. When you've got 1,000 words, you have room for one concept, and basically that's like one conflict, almost a scene, and that's it. Someone who writes maybe longer. I'm thinking of Essa's short story that was in what was it? Magazine of science fiction fantasy, or is it fantasy and science fiction? Yeah, fantasy and science fiction. I felt like Pasha was quite neurodivergent, but that was almost 8,000 words.
Yeah, there's more room. I think you'd have to be really focused and pick either an aspect of neurodivergence that you wanted that story to bring out, or like in science fiction and fantasy, you can bring in other elements to either represent or to comment on, like kind of going back to what we were saying with aliens and robots and like using other species or different worlds or
Mert Rustard. So there's an autistic author, Mert Rustard. They're non-binary, and they write loads of short stories. Some of them, a lot of them get into pro magazines. I think some of them are award-winning, and they do often have kind of neurodivergency as a feature. I can't remember the name of it. I don't know.
I think we're thinking of the same one. I think we're thinking of the same short story. But yeah, it was really well done.
I bow to all of you people who can write short stories. I have finally managed to wrestle my books down to the 100,000 word mark, and my editor and I are fighting to keep them there. So I think that I think that there's definitely room, but I don't think I'm the person who can do that.
I'm another writer. I would write everything in Flash, but there's no money in Flash fiction.
So I think that's about all the time we have. But before we go, I want to give all of our panelists the chance to let our audience know, again, I guess, their most recent or upcoming work, and then where people can find them online. So I guess, Essa, if you want to go first.
You're muted.
Essa, you're muted.
Well, I got the book up, though. That's all you need to know. Neurotypical is out, and the sequel is coming out this winter. You can find me online in most places at Essa Hansen, and I'm most active on Twitter, probably, unfortunately.
So Elisa Bonin, the name and the spelling are right here, I think right under my head. You can find me, if you Google that, you'll go to my website. You can also find me on Twitter at EAB Writes. So basically all those initials together. And I think there should be links to my books on Goodreads. So please add Brave to Goodreads. It really helps. And if you have a follow to spare, now's a good time, because this is the year when we'll get through all the exciting things like cover reveals and I get to talk more about my book and things. So be an early adopter. Come on, like it'll be great.
Yeah, I guess I've got a book coming up from Tor in 2022, or Harper Voyager UK if you're in Britain like I am. And my website is just myname.com, sunnydean.com. Not a lot goes on it at the moment. I'm probably most active on Facebook and Twitter, which are supposed to be really terrible platforms for writers, but I just struggle with all the other social medias, so there we are. Other than that, I sometimes write short stories, like 2 a year, if that. So, there should be one in Tor.com at some point.
Nice. My website is also just myname.com, sonorareyes.com, and so is my Twitter at sonorareyes. Yeah. I don't know what my Instagram handle is, so I'm not going to say it. I think it's like Sonora Reyes 1 or like Sonora.Reyes or something like that. I don't know what it is, but it's some variation of my name. And yeah, keep an eye on my Twitter because some things are going to be happening at some point. Yeah.
Intriguing.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that wraps everything up. Thank you to all of our wonderful panelists for their brilliant insights, and thank you for everyone who tuned in for this. This was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thanks for moderating.